since you're asking the question, and since you're all the way down in verse 10, do you want to kind of begin this out by kind of finding out what you've already found in Psalm 91 and what led you to this question to begin with?
Well, what leads to the question is, how do you interpret the question? So I interpret the Psalms I don't change really much my methodology when I go to the Psalms, other than I understand, I'm with the genre of literature I'm dealing with, but it's still, those are still God's words, each one of them, and meant to be understood. The psalmist makes a really strong statement, in particularly in the verses 9, 10, 11, where it looks like this is an absolute blanket statement. No harm's going to come to you. I will protect you from everything. And that obviously cannot be understood in an absolute sense. That does not reconcile with the rest of Scripture. So therefore, how does one explain that statement? That there will be no harm come to you, no harm to your home, no plagues to your home. That's the question. I mean, flowing down, God has, the psalmist has set forth, and I love the first part of this. Those first two verses are his testimony. Beautiful. Who is he? Never tells you. Never make. Now, I have my own guess as to who that might be, and it's just that. But I think there's a reason why we don't know, why we're not told who the psalmist is. But I just thought that was an interesting observation compared to the way we do testimonies today. Because the guy is he's telling you about his relationship with the Lord. And then he shifts in verses 3 through 13, the singular, either uses singular pronouns or singular endings all the way through. So now he's talking to the individual person. And he lays out what God's relationship is to the individual person, which is obviously a protector. He's one's protector. He provides protection differently, I think, than oftentimes we find protection. But when you get down to the 10th verse, you get this absolute statement. And the question is, how do you take that absolute statement? I have read, goodness knows, I probably have 40, 50 commentaries on the Psalm, and I have read every one of them. Most ignore it, which is typical, as you guys probably know, when you really have a serious question that you want answered. Now, I have worked my own answer. I don't have to teach this for 2 weeks, so I have time to get more input and to adjust my answer. I will tell you one I have rejected, and it's maybe because I don't have enough evidence, and so I'm certainly open. At this point, I have rejected interpretation that this is talking about protection from angels. It's really difficult for me to see that in the text other than the Lord's use of quoting that passage back to Satan. But I think that's for a completely different reason, to tell us not to mess up the psalm when we get there. But I do know some, actually quite a few. I have interpreted this as divine protection from angels. Now, maybe my resources are too limited. They're drawing this basically from Hebrew explanation of the Hebrew commentators' explanation. But I couldn't find enough evidence in what I own and could look at to say, you know what, I can buy that, I'm comfortable. So I'm just curious to how I've got my interpretation. I'm just curious to how you fellows interpret this.
You know, I found the same frustration with, I was looking through just in preparation for today through a couple of my better commentaries, and usually, you know, just like always, commentators just are pansies. They just absolutely back away from any real question, right? But the thing that occurred to me is that because it's right after Psalm 90, there seems to be some at least justification, right? He's talking about their tents, to think that maybe this is also a psalm of Moses and maybe kind of a counterbalance psalm to Moses. And so then the scope of those promises and the certainty of those promises might have been limited to the Exodus generation. right? Specific audience, right, to them. And I didn't read that anywhere. It just struck me as a possible explanation, because I've struggled with this psalm as well. I mean, these absolute statements are extraordinary. So, Carl, what do you think about the idea of maybe this Moses speaking specifically, right? So Moses is the kind of the first speaker, and then it also kind of gives some meaning to that, because he was in a very unique way in the secret place of the Most High, right? He was meeting with God in a way that nobody after him ever did.
I think it is possible, because I look at 90 dealing with corporate Israel in corporate worship, and now you're looking at the individual, and I consider living in accordance with God's word the highest form of worship. So yeah, that is something I have on my list of possible things. Yes, that's good observation. Thank you. I like reaffirmation. I'm always uncomfortable if I'm the only person who sees something. That's why I use my friend Ron Merriman to bounce stuff off of that, or bounce stuff off Eric or somebody else. I mean, you've got to realize, and I've got commentaries go back to the 1800s. So we've got guys who've been looking at these texts for hundreds of years. If you're the only guy to have seen that, maybe you want to take at least a double look.
A sober view.
Here's a question. Here's a question I have as I was looking through this too. Is it possible that this absolute statement is part of the former economy, the economy under the law? Because I don't find any type of statement made in the New Testament, or any statement made like this. Usually this particular promise found in Psalm 91, or this certainty here, is very, very different than the certainty promises and things that we find in the New Testament. So could it be possible that this is relegated to the old economy, the economy under the law? I'm kind of referring this tacitly back to what God told the nation of Israel concerning them following the law, not other gods, right? You don't bow to other gods. You don't do this. I'll make your land plentiful. I'll give you many many descendants. You won't get struck by the hornet. You know what I'm saying? You'll have many crops. Is it possible that it's associated with that? Which is why the psalmist is able to speak with such certainty.
I think it's a good observation. And Luther, no one else that I have read, and I've read a lot, nobody has made that statement. Good observation.
Really? Well, I think that's the big problem with interpreters hitting the Psalms, is that they immediately, if they had any dispensational sense, they immediately shake it off and forget that there was a huge distinction between the psalmist's position and ours. Same God, same character of God. But yeah, I mean, it's the reality that it's so easy to just slip into this, it means to us what it meant to them. Very rarely, right? So
I think you got to go who, what, when, where, why, and how. Who's it written to? What's the occasion of it? When is it applicable to? And I mean, it's obviously it's kind of got the overtones of a Davidic psalm. Could be a follow-up to Mosaic psalm, but even if it was Davidic psalm, this is. To me, it looks like when you have the dispensational change, God's people got a whole different set of things. In this world, you have trouble. Why? Because you have loved me. Now, this would almost exclude, if this were true in this dispensation, that pulls us. We could be claiming that, and just like people now are claiming this verse, I think, to protection from the plague and all this other stuff of the coronavirus and all that. I think that's a mistake, because in this world you have trouble, and you're going to be persecuted for what you believe. You're going to, so I believe the Lord changed it himself. he went through this, and that's why Satan throws this at him. He'll give his angels charge concerning you and all that, but still evil befell him when it was the right time. So, I mean, even the Lord, who did everything perfectly and perfectly followed the law, does this hold true? So I think we have to get to the remote context and put the systematic theology together and go who, what, when, where, why, and how, and try to answer those questions. Anyway, that's kind of the direction I would lean on this, but I'm open.
When I was in the Army, we had the chaplain that would use this verse as kind of the verse for encouraging soldiers. He'd say, "Now, if you're in trouble, call 911. That's Psalm 91:1. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shelter of the Almighty." And Psalm 91 kind of became a...
hey, that sounds like it. Hold on, Paul. Hold on for a sec. That sounds like something we need to do for Facebook theology.
What was that?
We've been doing a Thursday little thing. Luther and I have been taking apart some Facebook theology, things that people post as memes, and kind of laugh at it and kind of try to get some proper sense of understanding through it. And so,
that's wonderful.
Call 911. It's on Luther's YouTube page.
Oh,
it's not even the same numbers.
9110. It's like, what do you?
No,
okay.
he was referring to 91.1. So
yeah,
I've heard that before too. 911.
That's unique to me. That's funny. Okay, go ahead.
All right. So at the time, this is back when I was in the Army, training up for Iraq, all this number, and I was a very outspoken critic of Christianity at the time. And this becomes a big go-to for all of these fellow infantrymen that are training with me on how to survive should we come under fire. And I remember thinking, this is a really goofy thing you got going on, because you're claiming Psalm 91:1 about yourself, right? And applying the rest of the chapter to you, saying that God will deliver you from any kind of physical harm. So why does it matter to you whether we train or not if God's got your back? That was kind of my argument. And, this misuse of Psalm 91 really fed into a lot of my my apologetics against Christianity, if you will. So this is an important question.
And the other struggle that I have with this is that it wasn't true of the Old Testament saint either, in general terms, right? Because the individual Old Testament saint wasn't promised even the slightest bit of protection. It was only a corporate promise of blessing or protection. So if everyone was faithful, then everyone got the blessings. If only one person was faithful, take your Jeremiah, Daniel, whoever it is, you experience great hardship, even though maybe especially because you were righteous. So applying this on an individual level to the Old Testament saint doesn't work either in relationship to the Old Testament promises and covenants, or in practice as we see the lives. So that, to me, makes that even more makes this an even more challenging psalm, is that it was never true for anyone, at least on very plain level. I mean, I guess if we write it all off or not write it all off, but understand it in light of just the general character of God and poetic hyperbole, then fine. And really, I don't think that's an unacceptable way to look at the Psalms. They're Psalms. But it is fascinating, right? If we could claim this as just a pure, fact for fact promise, man, we wouldn't do a lot, like Paul's saying.
Now, Satan quotes verses 11 and 12 in the temptation. Christ did not refute the use, although there has been arguments that Satan is twisting Scripture. Is this Psalm Messianic with the singular you?
A lot of guys go that direction. Will. That's probably most common.
And it's problematic, right? Because he died on a cross.
Well, if it's Messianic, what advent is it talking about?
Right. Oh, yeah.
Is it Messianic in the Messianic reign concept.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that would work.
Now that fits. So we're kind of like using scripture. We're not looking at Psalm 91, and that's where the difficulty of looking at messianic psalms. I don't know about you, but if I read Psalm 2 in a vacuum, there's no way I look at that messianic.
No.
And so where then you got the Christological method where every single psalm is messianic. But the fact that this is you in the singular and not pluralistic leads me to think that it's talking about an individual person. And I've never heard the Moses angle and the fact that he was in the shelter of the Most High, in the shadow of the Almighty, and how he was protected. Joshua was given a similar charge in the fact that nobody would be able to stand before him. Now, of course, he suffered defeat at the hands of Ai. So it wasn't an aspect of nationalistic standing, but the fact that no other individual challenged his leadership. And that promise did come to fruition. And so there are certain promises made to individuals in the Old Testament that are very specific to that individual at a specific time.
And non-transferable and non-universal.
Right. And so, but at the same time, I always struggled. And I always ask this of every psalm, is it messianic? I always ask that question. One of my first questions I ask, who wrote it? What's the situation? Is there messianic aspects in it? When I talk through the Psalms, I've done it twice now, when I just basically just kind of do an overview of Psalm. I always ask that question, and it's hard for us to, I think, in our time frame, to both think in those terms and to come to conclusions in those terms.
You will see in that psalm, however, you have no idea from the psalm who wrote it. You have no idea of the circumstances which gave rise to the psalm.
Mm-hmm.
None.
Well, and you don't know who the speaker is, or I mean, there's three speakers here, right? First, or potentially three speakers. Either
I take there's three, Brad. That's what I did with it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I do too. I mean, it seems to flow naturally that way. So it doesn't really give us a clue as to who speaker 1 and speaker 2 are. Obviously, speaker 3 is God, right? But, or at least as I'm understanding it. But
yeah, that's what I did with it.
There's no input, like it's not like, oh, well, speaker 1's a priest and speaker 2's the people, or verse versa. I mean, you could guess at that, but you could only guess, It's tough.
Let's ask the Jew.
He comes alive. You ask and it is given. What do you have for verse 9? I'm curious. What do you have for verse 9? Because in my New American Standard Version, I find it a horrible translation unless you go to the side column, and sometimes those side columns are so much better. So the question is, what do you have for verse 9? Because verse 9, I think, and I do think, as I look through this and have seen this before, I don't know if there's 3 speakers or 3 people directed by the remember, Psalms is Israel's hymn book, right? It's the songs of the nation. It's usually about only a few things. It's about the coming Messiah, the Messiah that came, or about the nation struggling and suffering. That's majority of your Psalms, right? I mean, in a nutshell. And I think this Psalm, I believe what it does is it moves, verses 1 and 2 has one direction that it's speaking of, verses 3 through 8 is another, but 9, I believe, starts another section. That's why I said, what do you have for verse 9?
9, I take this, the speaker is, the speaker, verse 1, is still speaking. Thou, verse 2, is the individual that he's speaking to. Okay, that's what I've done with those.
Okay, but who do you say this? Who do you say is being spoken to?
Don't know. I don't know.
Okay.
Okay. I can't, from the Psalm, I can't know. I can read in, I can't read out. I hate reading in. Okay.
No. I understand that.
I mean, I can read in. He's speaking
anything.
to people. He's speaking to the people.
But if you go the way the Hebrew would flow, and this is maybe my lack of being a really good Hebrew speaker, but it says to me, for thou, the direction is for thou, O Lord, art my refuge. The psalmist is speaking directly to the Lord that I look at in verse 9, and he's calling this Lord, whoever, whether it's first, second, or third person of the triune God, he's calling this Lord his refuge. That's what I get from the first part of verse 9. And you could even you could either take the second part as another person being spoken to, or you can say it's the same person being spoken to with a different title. I would say it's a second, but he says the Most High, your dwelling place. So again, he's talking to a person who's called the Most High, who is their dwelling place. Whoever. So I see this as very much the future Messiah being spoken to, and in reference to his Father, because if you go to the next set of verses and skip verse 10, verse 11 is not misused by Satan, but used by Satan. About who? Verses 11 and 12 is used for basically Jesus's life on earth at that time. What? That Satan applied that to that, but was using it to get Jesus to do something evil. So he was misusing a verse towards Jesus, but using it because it was about Jesus. You kind of get what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So if you sandwich 9, 11, and 12, I'm thinking 10 still got a messianic idea behind it. And what we basically have, again, is the misfortune of not understanding what an absolute is in this. Because we look at the cross and we say, well, evil fell upon Christ at the cross, and there was a plague. He was experiencing some kind of plague, but that wasn't an absolute thing that happened to him. That was very much what? Temporary, right? That happened. The end game is ultimately Christ is what? The Messiah is the victor. He's the king. The ultimate is, so when it says no evil will befall you, I look at it like this, is no misfortune will come upon you that's deserved, because he's what? He's righteous. He didn't get anything he received was not deserved, right? So if you look at this verbal exchange that we have here with the word befall, I think we could do a lot more with that. And if we did that, if I'm not mistaken, we can look at that word from the Hebrew. Basically, it's not a very big, a highly used word, but somehow it's always incorporated with evil. So you kind of go, let's take hypothetically, and I know we don't want to read into anything. That's the last thing I want to do, but he's talking about someone in this section that's righteous. So no matter what happens to you in time, it's not the ultimate evil. I always tell people if they're dying, it's not for a bad thing, it's for a good thing, because death for us is a doorway or an entrance into glorification and final stage. But if this is my final stage, or if absent from the body, present with the Lord is my final stage, God sold me half a package. You know what I'm saying? The full package is I get a glorified body, that I'm like Christ. So even though in time evil may befall me and I may die, it's still not the ultimate. And I think here what I'm looking at is, even though he may have the misfortune, or I don't know what a better word would be, to come upon him, it wasn't the end evil. Evil didn't win. And the second part is, nor will any plague come on your tent. And we know Jesus did what? What did Jesus do when he came to earth? It's a great word. He tented among men, right? He set up his tent. So I love this, but I think, and if you, I'm not sure, I guess I got to look this up. This is me just talking off the top of my head. This word for plague, it's not really, it's used in a lot of different, plague could be it.
I'll bring it down.
It could be it's such a range of word. It's since it's this,
disaster, calamity. It's a very broad based.
Yeah, but it's usually, if I'm not mistaken, and maybe you could help me with this, Carl, because my tools aren't the greatest that I have sometimes. Isn't this only something that can come upon a man via another man, this word? In other words, it's not something that we would call like the coronavirus.
Let me look over.
Even though that may be something man-made too, sorry. I take it back.
I take it all back. The Chinese Communist Party's after us again.
Chinese, listen, you get all those little free packages mailed from China. Stop it. You don't know what's in those things. Open it up, poof, Corona.
Corona everywhere. But
that's why they get free postage. Stop it, America. Stop giving them free postage.
It is used in Exodus 11.
For
the Lord said to Moses, "One more plague I'll bring upon you."
Okay.
And upon Egypt.
So it's the
which
same
is dealing
word.
with, it's the same word. But
So
that's
what's
the
the
only
plague?
time that word plague is used in the Exodus account.
Okay, what was that plague?
That was the death of the firstborn.
The first one?
No, the death of the firstborn.
Interesting. Okay.
see, so the funny thing is, in making my argument again, not that I'm married to it, but it just does make sense for the poetic hyperbole. Verse
Right.
15 comes on to say, "He shall call upon me, and I will answer him." And this is kind of in keeping with what I understood Eric to be saying. "And I will answer him, and I will be with him in trouble, and I will deliver him and honor him." So again, this idea that we would read this and assume that there would never be trouble is a ridiculous assumption by the author. And he assumes that you're not a moron, right? He assumes that you're not going to take his words. I mean, right? It's not a safe assumption in my case, but in other cases, it probably is. Like he just assumes that you would never think, that you're going to get out without dying, right? That's always what I find when I'm pastor or, counseling people who are going through, especially end of life. They think, I never thought this was going to happen to me. Like, really? You thought you were going to get out of this one? Wow, that's sad. But especially given the world in which the psalmist lived, just surrounded by death, early death, premature death, death in childbirth, right? I mean, death was something that they had to be comfortable with. So even the thought, that there would be a promise that you would never get sick or never is ridiculous, right? So that to me argues for this. He's just giving a poetic hyperbole of the character of God and his caring, healing, protecting nature. Even though, as we said, or as we pointed out, he's never going to see that until the final steps, until, the kingdom.
And in that situation, if what you're saying is accurate there, that this is poetic hyperbole dealing with the individual, the nature, the character of the individual is taken into account in verses 1 through 2. And the fact that there's a statement made as a generalistic principle. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. And then the speaker speaks, I will say to the Lord, my refuge, my fortress, my God in whom I trust. And so I understand what you're saying, and I always have a difficulty understanding poetic hyperbole, because we're trying to train ourselves to speak to read normally, and poetic aspects of Scripture. People take a license with poetic hyperbole to a detriment, and they go when they don't understand something, or they think it's overstated. In fact, I deal a lot right now with that in Joshua, that all the different battles, and they killed everybody with the sword and all that's poetic hyperbole, and Joshua is just speaking overspeak just to demonstrate how good they were, because the victors write history books, right? And obviously that's not poetic, it is actual historical. So there's differences there, but if anybody can enlighten me as to how to understand the nature of, and to properly interpret poetic hyperbole, I'm all ears.
It has to do when the statement like this one goes into the ridiculous.
But it's not ridiculous if it's messianic in the Millennial Kingdom.
I mean, yeah, that's definitely true, but I think it's absurdist from any other perspective.
Take another way, it would not be ridiculous if you redefine evil properly.
True.
Okay, because from my perspective, I don't care what befalls a believer, regardless of what it may look like from the outside circumstances. If that set of circumstances further the believer's confirmation to the image of the Lord Jesus Christ, ultimately, it's ultimately for his spiritual well-being. Therefore, though you meant it for me for evil, it's not. So I don't take anything, and I've had a lot of, like all of you guys, I've had stuff I've had in my life that people would look good. Well, that's awful, it's horrible. No, it wasn't. No, not ultimately. Now, if you look in like what I call eternity's values, if you place any subset of what happens in life to a believer in light of eternity's values, if that believer is, and this is what this guy is doing, he is living his life's participle back in verse 1. So his fixed way of life is to live. He's living connected with God. He's living with fellowship. You're walking in fellowship with the Lord. From my perspective, it doesn't matter what happens. It really isn't evil, because it is going to be for my spiritual well-being.
And that's definitely a theological truth. But I mean, I do think like statements like "you shall tread upon the lion and the cobra," right?
Uh-huh.
Tell me that's not poetic hyperbole. That it's very obvious. Even if you could, why would you? I mean, unless you skin it first, it doesn't make a very good carpet, right?
Did this happen? If this is Mosaic, were these promises fulfilled to Moses? You're muted, Eric.
Which promises are you talking about?
All of them? Yeah, basically the entire Psalm 91 is
okay,
this.
We're back at the same thing. We got to ask ourselves who's being addressed and what time frame they're being addressed, because when you go through these, especially verses 3 through 8, I can't see anything other than the tribulation in those verses. I don't see anything in Moses' time, even though there was things that came upon the Jews at that time. But if you look at some of the prophetic passages in Matthew and Revelation, this falls into this. I believe this is speaking to the Jews during the tribulation. That's the slant I'm taking. So if you look at that, so again, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to step on you.
No, you're fine.
Well, if you look at it with the 144,000, this just, they get the seal of God on their foreheads. They are protected. I mean, these things will be, people will go after them. But from the way I understand it, they get sealed at the outset and they're standing with the Lamb on Mount Zion at the end.
Yeah,
and
but I'm looking at the rest of them because the tribulation is going to wipe out most of the Jewish population. There's an old adage I usually say when people say, "What do you think of the Holocaust?" I usually say, "You ain't seen nothing yet."
Well,
that tribulation is horrific, especially to the nation of Israel.
And the faithful die as well, though, right? I mean, the faithful,
yeah.
number of the faithful are preserved, but not all of them. So,
right.
and I think it's also challenging to put them in here. And I agree with you theologically again, but I forget, Mitzidka is masculine singular. So he'd be referring to the nation of Israel or some subset of the nation of Israel as a masculine singular, which would be uncharacteristic, right?
Not necessarily. I mean, he does masculine, he does feminine. It just depends on when he's discussing. But here's an interesting thing. I'm going to throw a wrench in this just for a second.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to Isaiah uses a lot about the nation of Israel. Let's just say Israel in general. and you don't know, and a lot of Jews will fight you on this because they'll say, oh, God's referring to the nation of Israel. Yes, and then no, because God's also talking about his servant, the greater Israel. So how do you explain that one? And that's really hard because when you go into Isaiah 42 to 53, I think, off the top of my head, a couple of times he calls Israel my servant, and then turns around and describes things that's never going to be part of the nation of Israel, never attributed to them as a nation. So he's talking about the greater Israel. So I think that's what we have here too. Yes, we have a picture of certain things that are happening, but I still believe he's still talking about the Messiah. I mean, at the end of the day, you know, I'm gonna stick with a lot of this book we call the Bible is about God's Messiah. Even though there's also a lot about the nation of Israel, and I don't know how many times pastors pass by both of those things because they want to apply everything to you and me. So, you know, you know, we just had Easter, and we've had a few pastors that said it's all about you, Easter. No, it's not. I praise God for Easter, but it's all about him, you know, and that's the problem we often have when we go to Bible study. It's we're so locked into maybe secondary or tertiary or even more application that we miss that it has nothing to do with you. Get out of it, you know? And I think as we look at this, verse 9 is the kicker as far as I'm concerned. And I'm not trying to beat something to death, but I want a better understanding of verse 9. I think it would help with verse 10. And the problem we also have, I have a paragraph break in verse 11. I think it's horrible. So you got all these things going on that you got moving there. And I don't think in the original Hebrew, there's paragraph markers that I don't think it's there. So,
and it's pretty amazing that they transfer in the translations, rather, they transfer that idea of 8, that obviously the your eyes is not the Lord, but then he very clearly moves to the vocative of Adonai, or of Yahweh. And so he's very clearly changing his address, right? He's not saying you have made, he's saying, but you, my Lord, are my refuge. Like, that's a very clear change of focus. And I can see why the translators didn't want to preserve that, because he's going down this you, whoever the recipient is, whoever the audience is. But he clearly steps away from that in verse 9. He has to, grammatically, it seems like to me.
Is it possible that the constant you singular, the thou, all the way through, is the singular because it's referring back to that very first word, the Yoshov of the first verse, he who dwells, the participle there. So just grammatically speaking, it's got to stay singular. So this whole thing is describing the attribute of dwelling in the shelter of the Most High, this shelter of the Most High, and this position, being in the shelter of the Most High, is something that can be applicable in many situations. When Daniel was thrown in the lion's den, in the shelter of the Most High, because God promised he was going to protect him, so he did. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the three of them, went into the furnace, they knew in advance, no, we are dwelling in the shelter of the Most High. Psalm 91 is applicable here. We're not going to be burnt up. When the 144,000 come, they will all individually be in the shelter of the Most High. So he's not necessarily describing one individual, and it's not for your entire life. I mean, Daniel eventually died, but rather he's describing this one position, if you will, of being in the shelter of the Most High, which is applicable over and over and over again. Not that that's something we should claim now.
Well, no, but that's just the thing, right? When we're reading a psalm like this, we would never claim it as a direct promise. We would only claim it based on the character of God. Like, God, you did this for David. You're still that God, right? I mean, that's the way we apply the Old Testament, at least responsibly in my mind. So actually, it's really fascinating you point that out, because you got 91:1 and 2, right? If let's just pretend that that's Moses speaking, and then some third party or some, second person, no matter who it is now describing the position of Moses and what's coming up, and really you could probably say a lot of this was, if it was just applied to Moses, we could probably say a lot of this really was, again, I still think you have to allow for the fact that there's a lot of poetic overstatement. But I mean, 1,000 did fall at his right hand and 10,000 at his side, and they were his brothers. They were at his side. They weren't, it's not his enemies, right? That's clearly not what's in view here, is that the enemy will fall. It's the people around him. And there were people all around him in Israel, right? Falling for their unfaithfulness. And yet he was protected on an individual level. I mean, I don't know, the more we think about it in that rubric, the more it becomes kind of an attractive way to understand the nature and limitation of the promises and still appreciate the character of God, to me.
Hey, Drew, from the Hebrew perspective, what's your insight as to understanding some of the grammatical structures of these verses, and specifically verse 9?
Well, verse 9 is you know what Eric pointed out, because you, O Lord, I mean, that's clearly what it says in the Hebrew. Opening up with the key, you, O Lord, my refuge, Elyon has made my habitation. I mean, that's just, to me, just kind of right out there in the open.
So is the you in verse 10 speaking of the Lord?
No evil shall befall you, because you, O Lord.
Grammatically speaking, does verse 10, 11,
no evil
12,
shall befall you.
It's saying not
It
befall.
could be.
See, my Hebrew grammatical understanding is that's why I asked Drew, because I know my graders when it comes down to grammatical expertise, but that's where I lack. And so I think that might be key. If we're trying to figure out precisely the interpretation, theologically, I don't think I disagree with anything anybody has said.
Sure.
Okay. If it's messianic, and and if it's then fine. If it's poetic overspeak, and his basically just God will be there for you, and that's his character, fine. If it's talking about Moses, fine. But if we can kind of nail this down as far as the grammatical structure of who is the you,
Well,
then,
based on immediate antecedent, I mean, you, O Lord, is the antecedent of the you that's in the next verse. And it's basically, if you're looking at a messianic thing, it's no evil shall befall you, O Lord. Neither shall plague come into your dwelling. I mean, it's just basically saying he's going to survive this whole thing as he becomes man. I mean, I'm reading some stuff into it, but grammatically, Carl, do you see any other way you can do that?
I took the participle back to the Lord. Yeah, interpretation.
It looks like to me the way it's got to be answered grammatically.
Then
I don't know how else you do. What else you do?
Well, it's also possible that poetically, speaker one's coming back in, right? So you have speaker two on, speaker one is, making these declarations. Speaker two then starts telling him about what's going to happen because he's made the Lord is most high. And then speaker one jumps back in and says, because the Lord, who is my refuge, blah, 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 is my dwelling place. Right. So it could be that speaker one jumps back in for a sentence.
well, there's no because there. Here's the interesting thing. I'm just going to throw a wrench in the whole thing. First of all, I want to know how much more we've confused Carl since this is Carl's question.
Yeah, I was wondering if he's going to teach this psalm or not when it comes up.
He's going to be like good commentators and skip it.
This will be the last time. This will be the last time he asks us for it.
No, you give me some thought process that's not been in my mind to work with, and that's what I'm after.
Okay, but when you go back to verse 11, I find it fascinating because it does start off with because, not for, because he will give his angels charge. So it's kind of interesting because, again, I'm not giving Satan a shout out, but he did use a verse that I believe was connected to who the Messiah was. I believe fully that the Satan believed Jesus was the Messiah, and he is the Messiah. He was just trying to use things out of context, like wonderful rabbis do today, and try and make things say that, and a lot of believers, church pastors, I'm not gonna say believers, will take things and just say, hey, this really works, let me use it. So, but Satan was using a good Bible verse referring to the Messiah. How's that? So if it's referring to the Messiah and it starts, verse 11 starts with because, it's got to connect to what? Verse 10, verse 9. Just me thinking. Because is a conjunction. I don't know what else to do with that. And a conjunction ties it together. It's just a simple key or chi. I think it's key in this context. Yeah, key. So it's tying verse 11 to verse what? It's got to go to verse 10, I would think. I don't know what else to do with it. I can't say it's going all the way back to something else. So if for conversation's sake, Satan is correctly applying this to the Messiah, but in a wrong he had a wrong agenda with it. But he does know this applies to the Messiah. That means verse 9 and 10 it's got to be about the Messiah. That's how I'm looking at it. So
that's in Matthew 4. Does anybody know the verse that it goes with?
I think it's
I have it here.
He applies it. I think he applies it in Matthew to Jesus, so to get Jesus to sin, because he's acting presumptuously, and therefore he has sinned.
Matthew 4:6, by the way.
I think Satan uses it for a direct reason. Oh.
Right, but I don't think what I'm saying is I think he knows it's for the Messiah, but not at that time, not at that place. So that's how I'm looking at it.
Yeah.
He understands if it's totally wrong, Jesus would have said, hey, that's not a verse about me, but he says, no, let's go back further. Let's talk about what's happening now, and he goes back to Deuteronomy to get the answer for Satan. He didn't say, hey, Satan, that verse is not about me. He's saying it's not about this time.
And apart from any other scriptures that refute Satan's use of that phrase, use of those verses messianically, I have to conclude that those verses are messianic. And so if I could find other verses that basically say that these verses are not messianic, then I would give that heathens, but they're used messianically, even though it's by the wrong person.
Do they have to be messianic though? I mean, he's taking, right, I see Satan as taking this as a promise from God to any perfect person, right? To anyone who would be perfect. And of course, that only really fits the Messiah. But I would say in general, you can look at the character of the Psalms and say, these are things that are specifically talking about the Messiah, and these are things that are talking about God's perfect relationship with a person if the person doesn't blow it, right? So, I mean, I guess I just wouldn't feel like I had to force it into the it's absolutely messianic category. It just seems like a different way in which scripture is being used, even responsibly. But I don't know. I think we sometimes overuse that term messianic as if it was designed to talk about Jesus. Like in certain cases it is, Psalm 22, Psalm 23. But in other cases it's just describing, what a good relationship with God looks like. And therefore it has to apply to the Messiah because he has a perfect relationship with God. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It's a good question, because in dealing with the humanity of Christ, we have to go ahead and understand that there's that humanity aspect, that Jesus Christ as a human gave us an example to follow.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore that reliance, that understanding upon God, regardless of what may befall me, I know that, as other people have mentioned, no true evil will fall upon me. Nothing. What can man do? What can man do to me? You know, and so my eternal perspective is beyond anything that can really be seen as negative in this life. So yes, I can see what you're saying, and I'm trying to be open about this as far as the interpretation of it. I do have difficulty because grammatically, I always lean back to a grammatical structure as far as interpretation goes, more than just a theological, and so I do have difficulties trying to place this outside of Messianic because of how it was used and the structure of verse 9, 10, 11. So, Eric, you're going to say something?
Yes. I think we're all kind of not being very smart. I'm blaming myself. So, verse 11, chapter 4, Matthew says, "Then the devil left him," Jesus, "and behold, angels came and began to minister to him." So Satan, however he was using the verses, it did happen. The angels have charge concerning him to guard him. We don't know what the angels did.
Well, we do know, because he was left on the pinnacle. They took him down and let him hit his foot.
Yeah, but I'm going to answer this to Brad. I'm going to answer Brad. The only angel I believe has ever ministered to me, I married. So shout out. But I mean, we don't know if, and I believe angels are watching over us in so many terms, but I can't find a verse that says that.
Okay, Amy.
You know, there's
Brad knows.
there is a verse in Hebrews that said we've entertained angels unawares, but I'm pretty aware I haven't. I mean,
y'all want to hear something heretical? Oh, I'm sorry. Go on, Eric.
You know, so I mean, if you just kind of put all these buttons and bells and things together, I think we've explored some interesting possibilities, and that's how sometimes you have to teach things. And Carl knows this as well as I. Sometimes you got to say, here's the options that are given to us,
right?
And we got to find out what satisfies the product the best. I'm getting ready to teach my favorite verse, 1 Corinthians 15:29. Baptism for the dead. And I was planning on practicing it, but the corona won't let us do it.
What's going on your tombstone when you go home to be with the Lord?
Yeah.
Corinthians 15:29. Remember me.
I'm going to tell Bobby this ahead of time. There's about 400 different beliefs. I may go through them all.
Just a full time, huh?
We got nothing but time.
So I want to know, Carl, what are you going to teach? Or do we have to like listen in?
Oh, no, I'll tell you what I'm going to do with it. I think I like Eric. I think it's primarily Messianic, but I don't want to tell people the Psalm's not for you. You know, don't waste your time reading it, because I really believe, as you've talked, the character of God has not changed. Right. Therefore, the principles, you can look at this Psalm and the principles of God having your back, so to speak, or God protecting you. Yeah, that principle is there. That principle does not change. I think it's an unchanging principle for somebody walking fellowship with God. One, you got to define evil, and I'll do some things with that. I don't look at this when I look at the great big picture. If I'm going to tell a believer, yeah, you can look at this and say, yes, you can look at this verse and say, God will provide protection. It's not protection from. That's not promised. It doesn't even promise it here. He will provide you protection in, and he will not allow you to go through something that is not ultimately your for your spiritual well-being. But I took it like Eric. This you're looking at this portion of the verse. I think or the passage. You're clearly dealing with something that applied to Messiah specifically, and has been fulfilled in Messiah. But I think the general teaching of the psalm has application to believers today because of the unchanging character of God. And that, yeah, you can rightly look at that. And if you're going through, I don't care what it is you're going through. And I like the fact that he never really tells me what his circumstances were. He uses words that are really relatively general. And I think the purpose behind that is because we go through all kinds of different, circumstances that cause distress. The word that he uses places an emphasis upon what you feel emotionally, the kind of emotional stress and distress that people go through. But you can look at this and you can understand that God will protect you if you understand protection, meaning he will protect you through this so that for your ultimate spiritual well-being will be improved. That this will conform you more to the image of Christ if you're allowed to go through that. He is not going to allow me to go through anything that's not necessary in life. That I believe. If it's not necessary, if it's not for my personal spiritual well-being and spiritual growth, I'm not going to go through it. And God only, I would say this to people, and I have no idea how many things I've been protected from. I have not a clue. And I think once at some point, if he flips that rug over, my ordinary rug over, and I see it, I'm gonna stand there with my mouth just in all of that. Yeah, stupid when you do that stupid thing and that dumb thing, and you thought you needed this thing. No, I was putting this hedge around you, dummy. I was protecting you so that you have protection that you were never aware of throughout life. But I don't want to shut people off from thinking that this is something that they can apply in life. And sometimes I think in our and I may be the worst of all people I know to say this, but about self, that sometimes in trying to be so exegetically, theologically, correct and tight in the box, that maybe I have shut people off from things that were truly designed to give them comfort. Whatever things were written earlier, they're written for a reason. This psalm was written for me too. Romans tells me it was. It clearly was. The question is, like you guys rightly said, okay, how do we understand that as being, written for my learning?
Well, I think the comfort comes from understanding if this verse is messianic and it would appear from the structure that it leans that direction, then the application comes from believing the fact that that there is a future hope that's coming, right? That things aren't going to be like this forever, that there won't be enemies or coronavirus or anything else like that, but we will actually live in true peace, true justice. I think the application comes from just believing the fact that the Messiah will come and he will make all things new and all things right and all things better. Is that?
Well, I would buy that 100%. Other than make the statement, unfortunately, I've got to make that connection for people. The people we teach, by and large, that I don't think they'll make that connection. I've spent now a long time making probably a huge mistake in my ministry when you have 40 years now to go back and look and examine things. I worked under the assumption, right or wrong, in principle, my responsibility was to teach. It was the Holy Spirit's job to make the application. I never, but for years and years and years and years and years and years, I never sought to show people how you actually this actually applies in somebody's life. I was very reluctant to tell people how I applied it. I understood it applied, but my reluctance to do that was because I was afraid they would think that's the way to apply it. And we're all uniquely different, and the application for us is uniquely different. But that's, I mean, I've now at least had a long enough ministry. I can look back and say, I probably have erred in not helping the people make the connection, just like what Luther said. Yeah, I'd see it. No, I probably wouldn't say it to anybody. I will now. I mean, I don't know if that helps you younger guys or not along the way. It's something I look at myself. If I could redo, yeah, I'd redo.
Yeah, one of the things that we've kind of emphasized, and Luther and I and Eric and I, we all been kind of working on this Bible study methods, and instead of like application, which is normally the Bible study method, we've gone towards theological impact, and we've taken it in the theological impact to the original audience, the theological impact to the church as a whole, and the theological impact to me. Instead of trying to make it a applicational, how do I use it specifically? I try to say, what's the impact upon an individual? And then you use that impact applicable however you want.
Good for you guys. Good for you guys.
So that's what we're trying to do more, rather than, and instead of trying that simple, observation, interpretation, application. I think that's
I hate to say goodbye, guys, but I got
Yes, it is time to go. But before you go, real quick, Paul has a question. What's your question, Paul?
Yes. Perhaps we could discuss this next time, but the doctrine of imminency, the imminency of the rapture that can happen at any moment. My question is, when did this doctrine become valid? Has it remained valid ever since it became valid? And has it ever lapsed in between? For example, we knew that Peter would die a martyr's death. So in the first century, if you saw Peter there, you know that the rapture is not going to happen as long as you got Peter. He's got to die before he can be raptured. Mm-hmm. So did it start after he died? Did it start with the establishment of Israel?
And is the doctrine of imminence right? Let's go ahead and ask the big question too.
I'll throw that one in there too. Is it a valid?
Is it a valid doctrine? Is doctrine of imminence a valid doctrine? And we'll go ahead and deal with that. I think it's a good doctrine to go ahead and look at and take a look at what people have said, and let's ask some questions about that. Ooh, hey, we're treading on thin ice right now.
Guys, it's been a great help. Thank you.
God bless everybody, and we'll see you again next week, Lord willing, and the COVID don't rise.
Shalom.
Shalom.
Bye.
Bye.